Okay, I'm going to start. So we focus today on the contrasts between two broad strategies of achieving inclusive societies where access to incomes and productive means are distributed in a more equal fashion. The contrast between the redistribution through the fiscal system and taxes and transfers, and redistribution through changes in the institutions that underlie the productive system of contemporary economies. What I'm going to do in my introductory comments is to spend time on two topics. One is I'm going to provide a broad taxonomic approach to mechanisms for addressing inequality. And second, I want to go a little bit deeper into one productivist method that deals directly with the creation of inequality and exclusion in the production sphere, which is also the one that's covered at much greater length in the reading assigned to you by Chuck Sable and myself. So to introduce the taxonomy and the broader discussion about how one can address inequality, I think it's useful to start with this picture, which is a picture that shows trends in inequality in two different sets of societies. The picture on the left is the United States. The picture on the right is Western Europe. If you simply focus for the time being on the US picture, the red line shows what has happened to the income share of the top 1% of the households in the United States. A rather remarkable increase, near doubling from around a little bit over 10% to over 20% since 1980. And that significant increase in incomes at the very top is accompanied with a parallel bottoming of the bottom 50% of the distribution. A really very remarkable rise in inequality in the United States. If you try to draw the same picture for Europe, actually it looks, on average, the rise in inequality looks in Europe much more moderate, nothing like these crossing trends in the income shares of the top 1% and the bottom 50%. There are many different reasons that are still being discussed about what the reasons for how these distributive outcomes have been so different in these two different parts of the world. After all, many of the technological and globalization trends that we've discussed earlier and we'll come back to are trends to which both Europe and the United States had been subjected to. And why have they responded so differently? It could be because of the manner in which their economies are organized. It could be the much more extensive role of the state in Europe. We might come back to that a little bit. But for the time being, all that I want to suggest is that what this picture gives us is a very potent sense of how, in fact, institutions and policies moderate and influence and either amplify or reduce the impact of sort of general technological and globalization-related shocks, that there is a lot that can be done in terms of what humanly devised institutions and social arrangements and political institutions, political decision-making can do in terms of influencing inequality. So when we think about how we're going to be addressing inequality, I find it useful to focus on two different kinds of questions, and that's where my taxonomy is going to revolve on. One is exactly what stage of the economy are we going to be focusing on, and secondly, what kind of inequality do we focus on? Do we focus on the bottom of the distribution, on the top, or in the middle? And that's the two dimensions of the taxonomy that I'm going to be laying out. Let me start with the question about the stages of the market economy. I think I may have shown you this picture before. It was in an earlier set of slides. In any case, think about how the economy produces incomes and the distribution of incomes in society. Think about it as happening in a number of stages. Starting from the top left, people enter the economy. Households enter an economy with a set of endowments and with a set of social connections and networks. They have a certain amount of education, they have a certain amount of access to financial resources, access to capital, and they have social capital. They have their own networks with which they come into production. Then we have the whole system of production, of investment, innovation, employment. That's where really sort of the economy produces goods and services, and that is going to produce what we call the market outcomes, a set of wages, salaries, profit streams that accrue to different groups of individuals, and that ultimately is what produces the income and wealth distribution in society. So if we think about the economy in terms of these stages, we can first of all distinguish between points of intervention or policies that affect pre-production versus post-production. That is that we can we can think about redesigning policies or institutional arrangements prior to the stage at which production, innovation, employment decisions are taken, or afterwards. So for example, a kind of an example of a policy that would be pre-production or pre-distribution would be our policies on education, investing in education, increasing the educational endowments and the skills of the workforce prior to becoming workers, entering the production sphere. Similarly, the UBI, sort of a kind of a universal basic income, is also meant to give everybody a kind of access to a certain amount of resources, a certain amount of financial capital, and happens before the production stage. Of course, after production, we have the whole system of redistribution. We can tax firms, we can tax capital, we can have a progressive income tax to redistribute income after workers and employers and capitalists, rentiers, have had access to their streams of income. We can redistribute in the post-production stage. But what we call productivist policies and the set of policies and institutional arrangements that I think both Roberto and I are the most interested in, and in many ways the most innovative area of thinking currently, even in mainstream economics, is this stage of what is happening actually at the stage of production, employment, and innovation. There's a whole range of policies, from industrial policies to innovation policies of the sort we've talked about last week, space-based policies or spatial policies, labor market regulations, competition policies, other rules or regulations that specifically relate to employment, such as a public employment guarantee or federal employment guarantee. All are going to be policies that enter or intervene directly in the stage of production. And I'm going to be talking in the second half of my remarks specifically about one such set of institutional arrangements. Now, so I've drawn a distinction along one of these two dimensions. With respect to the question, at what stage of the economy does policy intervene? I've suggested that we can distinguish among at least three different stages: pre-production, production, and post-production. But there's also a second stage, a second dimension, which is the response to the question, what kind of inequality do we care about? Are we trying to basically bring the top up? So most anti-poverty policies, or thinking in terms of poverty reduction or poverty alleviation, is really about addressing the needs of the poorest people or people at the very bottom of the income distribution. Are we really concerned that people at the very top are too wealthy, either because we think that has adverse implications for the way that markets are organized, or because we might worry that too much wealth concentration has adverse effects on the way that our political system operates? Are we finally concerned about what is happening with the middle classes, the distribution at the very middle? That might be really issues having to do much more with economic insecurity or economic precarity that the middle classes might feel. So if you think about this taxonomy that distinguishes across these two dimensions, and in each dimension makes this threefold division, we have essentially a 3x3 box of different types of remedies or different ways of thinking about what we ought to be doing. Now, when we think about the actual discussions about inequality, it's very easy to fill this entire box, this entire matrix. There's essentially no cell in this matrix that is not sort of actively being considered in terms of various types of policies. So, for example, if we take the bottom right cell, if you care about inequality at the very top, and with respect to post-production interventions, the wealth taxes, which have become a very important source of discussion and debate, would be in that cell. Or the kinds of most discussions about social safety nets or social insurance policies are really, once again, post-production policies, but are targeted much more to the middle of the income distribution with respect to addressing questions about economic insecurity. And of course, sort of traditional US policies with respect to social transfers, aid to poor families, and so forth, are mostly post-production policies that are addressing the needs of the very bottom of the labor markets. Now, traditional policies, and I think sort of most of the kind of social policies of social democracies in the kind of heyday of social democracy in Europe and to some extent in the United States, essentially the focus was almost exclusively on sort of these kind of cells on one and the other end of this matrix. Essentially, on the one hand, investment, public spending on health and education is a way of increasing the endowments with which families, households, workers enter the marketplace. And then post-production redistribution through the tax system of transfers and the welfare state. And not so much wealth taxes, although they were tried in Europe in a number of different ways, but certainly through a high level of taxation that in turn financed relatively generous social safety nets in traditional social democracy. Increasingly, while the focus on those sort of two on those cells in the previously the cells that I previously circled, while the focus on them has not disappeared, I think increasingly discussion is moving into this sort of kind of a middle cells of the matrix. And that's largely, I think there's a kind of a logical story here, which is that when you think about how inequality is actually generated, a lot of it is really generated in the process of production and employment and innovation and investment. So our focus here in terms of dissemination of the most advanced technologies from the vanguard to larger parts of the economy is really fundamentally concerned about being able to draw in larger parts of the economy into this sort of network of advanced production and good jobs. I would say even more so that the part of the matrix that might be the most significant in terms of its being causally related to our present social problems and political crisis is that if you look at the protests from France to Chile, the rise of far-right politicians everywhere and in the United States, it doesn't seem to be linked so much to inequality per se as it is to the relative rise of economic insecurity and the creation in the labor markets of increasingly insecure employment, and a sense that a larger part of the labor market is feeling itself as outsiders, unprotected from the uncertainties and precarities of having access to good jobs. That would explain, for example, why in France, for example, you have not had a significant rise in economic inequality, yet some of the social strife also very much is a feature of French society, why in Chile, in fact, inequality has been decreasing in the last 20 or 30 years, but they've been struck with a very similar sense of social disaffection and conflict. I think what's happening is much less concern about sort of the very bottom of the income distribution, much more about sort of the disappearance of and the increasing precariousness of sort of middle class jobs and the middle class. So that's the cell that I want to focus on for the remainder of my comments, and provide one way of thinking about how policy and a new set of institutional arrangements can be created to address this particular cell, in particular with respect to how one can create good jobs. So I'm going to call this, the paper itself is called Building a Good Job Society, but this is very much in line with our discussion in this class of productivist policies. So good jobs, that's the key term. What are good jobs? Good jobs are going to be jobs that provide secure employment with benefits and middle class pay, giving workers a sense of autonomy, satisfaction, prospect for advancement. It could take any number of different forms. It could be part-time or work with flexible work schedules. And obviously, sort of, the specific parameters of what a good job is, pay levels, benefits, and other conditions would depend both on community standards and on the preferences of individuals. So there's a lot of provisionality here, which is in fact part of the idea about how we think about this good job strategy, is that there's a lot of ex ante provisionality in the way that these things are defined, with a lot of onus on the possibilities of a kind of iterative evolution of these definitions over time as they take. So what is this good job strategy going to be like? It's going to be a range of interventions targeted expanding productive employment opportunities, that is extending the benefits of these most productive, most innovative kinds of work arrangements and technologies by supporting both firms and workers in an effort to expand their capacities so that a larger number of workers can participate in these dynamic sectors. There are three prongs. If you want to think about sort of what this would in practice consist of, they would consist of three prongs. One is dealing with existing jobs and existing firms. So address increasing the skill level and productivity of existing jobs and the competitiveness and productivity of existing firms. Think about it, for example, as a kind of provision of expanded extension services to improve management or cooperative programs to advance technology, providing help with business plans, providing help with marketing, all with an eye towards expanding employment at the same time that overall productive capacities of existing firms are enhanced. Second is to increase the number of such firms. That is to increase the number of good jobs by supporting startups and the expansion of existing local firms that are on the verge of crossing over into this more dynamic segment, or indeed by attracting investment from firms elsewhere, by bringing in firms from elsewhere. And third, addressing labor and labor skills directly, increasing the scope and range of active labor market policies or workforce development programs, so that there is a continuous program of investment in skills, especially on sort of groups that are at risk or younger workers, school leavers, to prepare them for the kinds of skills that are required for good jobs. So this third category focuses directly on jobs, on the creation of skills on the part of the workforce. Now, of those three, I would say that probably the part that exists the most in the current configuration, in the current landscape, is the third. So these are called the workforce development programs. The second takes place in a kind of a very distorted form where local communities or states might employ tax incentive or tax credits or tax subsidies to attract large employers from elsewhere. Think about the race to the bottom of different municipalities to attract Amazon headquarters to their cities. But doesn't really go much beyond that, and there's only limited range of thinking or programs that exist with respect to the first prong of that. So the essential quid pro quo that's involved in this proposed good job strategy is one, on the one hand, one where firms recognize that they could benefit from a range of services and public inputs that will be provided not just by government agencies but also by local community organizations in terms of having access to a stable, skilled workforce, in terms of help with locating reliable other firms that could form part of horizontal and vertical networks, and a whole series of institutional support from government in terms of technology, contractual and property rights enforcement, and so forth. So many of these are things that pose collective action problems, which firms acting together with other firms and local public agencies or local community agencies can solve collectively if there is a sense that this has to be done together rather than in a kind of a decentralized market setting. The other side of the quid pro quo is that as firms understand that they need such services in order to be more productive, they also need to understand that they need to create a sufficient number of good jobs, because these good jobs are a source of significant externalities for the communities in which employers are located. So this is not just a question, as we stress in the paper, of inequality and inclusion and social justice. It's a question fundamentally of economic inefficiency, in the sense that where good jobs go scarce, you have a very wide range of social problems, from broken families to drug abuse to crime to political polarization to rise of authoritarian values, all of which result in a breakdown of social and political order, which has sort of, if you look at it from a purely instrumental sense, have significant economic costs at the same time. So the other side of the other side of this bargain is for governments having certain kind of leverage over firms to get the firms to internalize these kinds of externalities. So put very crudely, the local communities and government agencies are there to help firms upgrade their productive and employment capacity, but in return for these firms undertaking a certain commitment to expanding employment and good jobs. And because this quid pro quo is embedded in a situation with very high dimensional uncertainty, everything from what the definition of a good job is, to what the technological opportunities are, to what firms can and cannot do, to the kinds of services that public agencies can or cannot provide. This is a setting in which the very simple-minded economic remedies, such as employment subsidies or wage subsidies, are not very well suited to, as we explain further in the paper. So this is a form, when you think about what I'm describing here, it's a kind of what used to be called industrial policy, where the government is actively intervening to affect the structure of production, the direction of technological change, the structure of production, and promoting certain types of economic activities over others. But it's very different from the traditional mode of industrial policy, and that's sort of the distinction that I want to draw, and the distinction helps put in better focus what's new about this, or what is distinctive about this good jobs focused industrial policy. And I should say that industrial policy is typically associated with promoting manufacturing activities, specifically industrial activities, and this good job strategy doesn't focus specifically on manufacturing or industrial activities. So the traditional type of industrial policy, which is associated with the East Asian model of industrialization, is where the government essentially exercises a kind of top-down set of incentives. The government decides which sectors ought to be promoted, and then the government decides what are the instruments for promoting those sectors. So if you ask the question, what is that government's industrial policy? It would be a kind of a matrix. Maybe on the columns, you'd have sectors that are being promoted, and down the row, you'd have the specific incentives or the specific policies that government employs to promote those sectors. So in the South Korean case, for example, in the late 1970s, it might be shipbuilding, it might be steel, it might be heavy chemical industries. So those would be sort of like our sectoral priorities. And going down the list of instruments, it would be things like export subsidies or credit subsidies that are provided directly to producers in those sectors. Okay? As is by now well recognized, this kind of industrial policy has not been very successfully reproduced in other settings, and for a number of good reasons. Because it presumes a lot of ex-ante knowledge and a lot of competence on the part of public agencies. It presumes a lot of competence and knowledge because the government has to make those selections appropriately. In the case of South Korea, what the government essentially did was to look at what Japan had been producing 10, 20 years earlier and say, well, this is the stuff that we can produce today. So the selection was based on simply looking at other cases. It also presumes a lot of honesty and competence in the sense that once you're involved in a program like this, you need to guard against producers and investors sort of gaming the government and getting the subsidies without necessarily undertaking the investment decisions that the program calls for. This sort of more contemporary models of industrial policy, even if not exclusively focused on industrial policy, on generating good jobs, and I'll give you a few examples in the next slide, is very different. It's much more, instead of thinking about sort of specific sectors and specific policies, it's much more a kind of a meta regime of setting up a set of processes, a set of institutionalized dialogues and mechanisms of collaboration to identify essentially what's going to work, what's not going to work, and to iteratively identify constraints and opportunities while policies are being continuously revised. So it's an ongoing process. So if the answer to your question, what is your industrial policy under the traditional setting would have been my industrial policy is I promote shipbuilding and steel with credit subsidies and export subsidies. Under this new mode of industrial policy, your answer, what is your industrial policy, would be I have these institutionalized processes from the very sort of national level to the subnational level where different levels of government and different types of community organizations are involved in an ongoing process of dialogue and strategic collaboration with these sets of producers. And these are sort of the mechanisms of monitoring, evaluation, and policy revision that's been built into this kind of process of developing solutions over time. So it doesn't presume a lot of knowledge ex ante because it presumes that you start with a lot of uncertainty. It only presumes that you can develop more knowledge as time goes. So it's much more agnostic than the traditional East Asian model of industrial policy. And similarly, it doesn't necessarily presume that there's a lot of trust, a lot of competence on the part of the government necessarily to get the firms to do what the government wants. It simply presumes that that kind of trust and cooperative modes of behavior can be developed over time, starting from relatively small steps. So I'd like to summarize the kinds of, to draw some kind of parallel to the discussion of universal principles of institutional design from last week. I would say that there are 4 types of design principles that go into thinking about how such processes of collaboration can be put in place. One is this notion of embeddedness. And the notion of embeddedness refers to the idea that unlike in the traditional East Asian model of industrial policy, we do not presume that the government actually has all the requisite knowledge. In fact, the knowledge is embedded in the activities of different participants in production, employment, innovation decisions. And because the required knowledge about the opportunities and constraints are diffused widely within society, that the instruments of the government have to be also significantly embedded in those processes. It can't simply be up top and deal with producers in a purely arm's length kind of a basis. So the traditional model of regulation, which is the government just set a simple set of rules and then just set aside, doesn't work. The government has to be involved in this process with firms in a much more ongoing kind of a way. The second is precisely because this process is subject to very high dimensional uncertainty, and the requisite solutions are going to be local and contextual, unknown ex ante, and not necessarily generalized very well across context and across space. So there are a number of features that have to be built into this relationship of iterative collaboration, openness to experimentation, continuous monitoring, and ultimately, of course, ability to revise policy. So where this process really makes a relatively large demand on institutional capacity is really on the ability to revise policies, to learn, monitor, and revise policies. That's where the emphasis on institutional capacity would be. Not on sort of presumed honest or competence or omniscience ex ante, but an ability to revise policies over time on the basis of real learning. Okay. Third, very importantly, one dangerous downside of embeddedness is that the government can end up being in bed with rather than embedded in these processes. So being in bed with the producers themselves or the firms themselves is essentially the danger that firms are going to be able to game the system, and this becomes a set of incentives to produce and distribute rents to those firms that are already politically connected. Therefore, putting into this process certain elements of sticks as well as carrots is going to be very important. In other words, the government having sort of clear benchmarks about what constitutes provisional success, what can be justified ex post on the basis of ex ante investments, and being able to act accordingly. That's another element of the capacity of the government to proceed along these ways. And finally, I think just to make sure that because the way that I've described this process is really a kind of an ongoing relationship between various agencies of the government and on the one hand community actors and on the other private firms, it's very important to keep in mind that the ultimate objective of this is to benefit society at large and not necessarily to benefit any narrow segment of producers or any narrow segment of workers. So the whole notion of a broader accountability, an ability to explain what is being done and why, and how that serves a broader society is the fourth critical design principle for this. These design principles might look like they're abstract, they're desirable on paper, but is it at all possible that they actually exist in the real world? Can the real world actually behave in that way? There are, in a number of very different domains, in fact, activities that go on where many of these principles have been embedded, or at least have developed over time, and that these practices do in fact operate. Some of these things we've talked about before, like DARPA, or the ARPA-E equivalent. DARPA is also described in greater detail in the readings for this session. The US Manufacturing Institute, the Project Quest, which is a kind of a workforce development project that I've already mentioned before. And many of these processes exist also in middle-income countries where you might think that there is not enough sort of state capacity to develop and run these kinds of problems, including some, such as Argentina, where you might think of as a kind of an exemplar of failed industrial policy. But it turns out, if you look at the agricultural research and training institutes of the Argentinian state, it has been extremely successful, operating along these sort of lines of very close embedded iteration and collaboration with private producers in agriculture. Okay, I'm going to end by identifying what I think are sort of four key advantages of this way of thinking about building up an inclusive middle class and connecting the jobs problem with the technological or productive dissemination problem. And these features also relate to many of the discussions that we've already had and some of the themes that we'll continue to develop. One is that this is a structuralist approach, which rather than taking the system of production, innovation, and employment as given and simply trying to tinker along the margins, either sort of pre-production or post-production, it focuses directly on the process of production and innovation and employment, and tries to influence those incentives directly. So it targets the generation of productive inequalities at source, rather than trying to deal with that as an after effect. So sometimes I like to think about this as a kind of a transition from a welfare state model of capitalism. Think about sort of the social democratic model of Western Europe or Scandinavia, where we focus essentially either on sort of increasing the endowments of individuals and then post-production redistribution. This is a kind of a productivist innovation state counterpart to that, where we're actually directly targeting the productive stage of the economy. Secondly, there is very little in this approach of the kind of traditional market versus state dichotomy. So this really no longer really applies here. And I think it breaks us away from this kind of institutional fetishism that tends to look at these issues of production, innovation, employment, distribution as a kind of how much market, how much state. This way of looking at the productive process recognizes that the state and the market and productive actors are all in it together from the get-go. So there is no simple demarcation. Third, an issue that I've mentioned before, and I think sort of has been implicit in a lot of our discussions here, is that this is now no longer a distinction between achieving economic performance and achieving equality and inclusion. This dichotomy between efficiency and equity, this no longer holds because the absence of good jobs, the lack of productive dissemination of advanced technologies is at once the source of economic underperformance and inefficiency as it is a source of economic exclusion, inequality, and uncertainty. So the issues about equality, inclusion, and economic growth, those two agendas essentially become one and the same. You cannot treat one without treating the other. Finally, and I think this is where sort of our respective agendas, I think, also converge to a significant extent, is that when you start thinking about the requisite institutional arrangements in the productive sphere from this lens, the traditional dichotomy or the traditional debate as to whether you get institutional change in a kind of by way of incremental reforms or by way of radical transformation or revolution, the age-old debate between reform versus revolution, this also dichotomy disappears and doesn't make a whole lot of sense because this way of incremental iterative change that starts from the margins of what already exists but is open to experimentation, ongoing iteration and revision also opens up the scope and possibilities of rather significant and radical institutional change over time as well. So it's no longer about where do we start. The potential horizon and the possibilities are quite wide, but it doesn't presume that we're making a sort of a very big leap from the unknown from the get-go. Okay, all right. So let me just stop here, and we'll move to Roberto before we open it up.
So it's the great subject of inequality. And my remarks are almost wholly complementary to what Danny has said. I agree with almost everything he has said, but I'm not sure that he will agree with me. And the heart of what I have to say has to do with the relation between change that shapes the fundamental distribution of advantage and the attempt to correct that distribution after the fact through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. And then having established a position with respect to that issue, to state some principles that might guide our thinking about the important, albeit subsidiary role of corrective redistribution. I want to begin, however, with both a philosophical and a historical prelude to my central argument. The philosophical prelude has to do with how we should think about inequality and what conception of inequality should guide us in this effort. Now, the contemporary ideological debate, indeed the ideological debate for the last 2 centuries, has taken largely the form of what you could call a contest between shallow equality and shallow freedom. In that contest, we think of the left or the progressives as those who accord priority to equality, and the right or the conservatives as those who give priority to freedom. And by shallow, I mean that the egalitarian commitment or the commitment to freedom is pursued against the background of the established institutional arrangements. That's the sense in which the commitment is shallow in this vocabulary. And my argument is that when the egalitarian commitment, however radical it may seem to be in the abstract, is constrained by the acceptance of the institutional arrangements, especially the present way of organizing the market order, it cannot be fulfilled very far. Now, an example of this problem is the nature of the theories of distributive justice that have been recently most influential in the Anglo-American world. For example, the Rawlsian theory of justice. On their face, these theories seem to be radically egalitarian. They give priority to the promotion of the interests of the least advantaged. But in practice, what they are is a philosophical or pseudo-philosophical prop to the homely activities of compensatory redistribution in late 20th century social democracy. And there are reasons to think that this attempt to achieve equality by corrective redistribution, that is, by redistribution after the fact, after the market has generated its inequalities, are very severely limited. So the pragmatic residue of the egalitarian commitment in this conception of the ideological conflict is simply the attempt to attenuate the inequality generated in the market through retrospective tax and transfer. Now, what would be the alternative to that view? You might think the alternative would be deep equality. Deep equality would mean priority to equality of outcome or of circumstance. As inequality increases, as there is accumulation of income and wealth, we reverse the accumulation through retrospective correction. For example, in a model of distribution of land, a classical model in which land cannot be alienated, or if it is accumulated, we put everything back to the status quo ante. So we're all poor, but we're poor together at the same level. Now, no one wants that. So deep equality is not the true aim of humanity. This attempt to achieve at any cost an equality of outcome or circumstance. What has been, in fact, the main aim of the progressives, for example, of the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, was not deep equality, but what you could call deep freedom. To bring the life and the experience of the ordinary man and woman to a higher level of intensity, scope, and capability. And then the struggle against inequality is entirely subsidiary to that larger objective. Now, implicit in that idea is another conception of the equality that we want. It is not equality of outcome or circumstance on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is both narrower and deeper than equality of opportunity. It is equality in the enhancement of agency, equality of empowerment. Not just opportunity generically, but opportunity to act. And that's then the conception that, according to this view, should be at the heart of our thinking about equality. A different conception of the contrast between the left and the right, the progressives and the conservatives, results from that idea. So on this view, the conservatives are the ones who think that it is natural for human life to be small. And the exception is an elite of heroes, adventurers, saints, thinkers, entrepreneurs. And the progressive idea is that we can become bigger only if we become bigger together. And we resist inequality, although there's no fixed metric, because it is a constraint on this shared empowerment. And the method is structural change, meaning change in the established institutional arrangements and the ideological assumptions associated with them. Change that, even if it is revolutionary in its ultimate outcome, is necessarily piecemeal, step by step, but cumulative in a direction informed by an idea. Now I come to the historical prelude. In the medium to long term, the single greatest influence on equality among nations is the diffusion throughout the world of the most advanced practice of production. And in the short term, it is migration, the movement of people in the world. With respect to inequality within nations, the most important influence on equality is the ability to share in the most advanced practice of production, the topic of our discussion over the last few weeks. But in the short to medium term, the greatest influence has been war. There's a long historical literature about the effects of war and its aftermath on inequality. I put on the book the name of a recent work, which is an example of this literature, the great Leveler, Walter Scheidel, a historian. And we have alluded in previous discussions to this idea of a war economy without a war. How can we, without war, achieve the equalizing effects of war? To begin addressing that question, we have to distinguish the different elements of the effects of war and find functional equivalents to them in peace. So we could bring those effects under three main headings. The first is the growth effect. In great wars, like the Second World War, growth accelerates. There's a massive mobilization of national resources. I gave the example in an earlier class. In the first 6 months of 1942, the total volume of military procurements was greater than the total GDP of the United States in 1941. And not only is there an acceleration of growth, but the powers of the state and of public investment are enhanced. Now, what's the peacetime equivalent to that phenomenon? That has been the object of much of our discussion in the preceding weeks. The second effect could be brought under the heading of plasticity. Large-scale mobilization of resources comes together in the war economy with radical institutional innovation. So, for example, in the Second World War, the Americans, when they needed to, cast aside their sacrosanct dogmas about the market order and ran the economy in a completely different way. And radical institutional innovation is a condition of this marriage of growth to equality and inclusion. Now, how can we achieve plasticity in peacetime? And the beginning of an answer is by creating institutions, both economic and political, that have among their attributes the attribute of facilitating their own revision, of being corrigible in the light of experience. That is the institutional basis of plasticity. The third set of effects that connects war with equality could be brought under the label of the solidarity effect. So in war, there are great sacrifices, and then the elites recognize that these sacrifices must be compensated, they must be rewarded by policies that promote greater equality and inclusion. But this version of the solidarity effect is not sufficient to capture the whole of this phenomenon. There's something else. Going back to the example of the Second World War. In the Second World War, the most terrible war in history, rates of suicide and depression fell in all of the belligerent powers dramatically. And then they rose again just as dramatically as soon as universal peace was reestablished. Now, this tells us something about who we are. And what it tells us is that we all want to live for something greater than ourselves and to forget ourselves in sacrificial action. And so there must also be a peacetime equivalent to this principle. And the beginning of the peacetime equivalent is the multiplication of forms of collective action in society, within and outside the economy. That is the only reliable basis of social cohesion or solidarity. Doing many things together. In the cooperative character of education, in the participation of civil society in partnership with the state, in the provision of public services, in the role of cooperative competition as part of the background to the knowledge economy, and in a high-energy democracy that requires people to engage in organized form in public life. Now then I come to our central discussion today, which is the relation of production to equality. And basic idea. It's the same idea that Danny explored just now with a somewhat different taxonomy. And instead of distinguishing three levels, pre-production, production, and post-production, I want to simplify and distinguish just two. Diminishing inequality by correcting the inequalities generated in the present market order, including the present organization of production, and diminishing inequality by innovating in the arrangements that shape the primary or fundamental distribution of advantage. Now, the basic insight is this. This is the intuitive core of the idea. The initiatives that reshape the primary distribution of advantage have more promise, greater reach, greater potential than the attempt to correct the inequalities after the fact through retrospective redistribution by progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. The justification of this intuition is simple. If we attempt to correct the fundamental distribution after the fact by progressive taxation or redistributive spending, we established a tension, a contradiction between the established economic incentives and arrangements, the framework for making wealth, and the egalitarian commitment. And this tension is captured in the traditional vocabulary of the tension between efficiency and equity. So if, for example, the inequality is deep, increasing, because it is anchored in a deepening chasm between the advanced and backward parts of production, the retrospective correction by tax and transfer would have to be massive to make up for the inequality. And long before it reached the adequate threshold of correction, it would begin to disorganize the established economic arrangements and incentives, and to exact an unacceptable cost in output. That's the problem. So it would be much better, if we could, to deal with the problem of inequality earlier in the actual organization of the market order, rather than to attempt to correct for the inequality after the fact. Now, this intuitive idea actually conflicts with a certain version of orthodoxy. So, for example, I'm just remarking to Danny an early work of Thomas Piketty stating this orthodoxy, his Economics of Inequality, published in 1997, which compares what he calls direct redistribution to fiscal redistribution. By direct redistribution, he means the attempt to mandate a higher return to labor. For example, by increasing through law the nominal wage. And the result is then to undermine the price system, the system of relative prices, as a framework for the efficient allocation of resources. He says that's much less good then fiscal redistribution, which corrects this inequality. It will result, for example, direct redistribution, what he labels direct redistribution, in the employment of fewer workers and in a preference for the substitution of labor by capital. Now, notice two things about this proposition, this orthodoxy or this pseudo-orthodoxy. The first is the understanding of direct redistribution, mandating a higher nominal wage. What is excluded is precisely what we are discussing, which is a change in the institutional arrangements of the market order, including the institutional organization of the production system itself. For example, through the empowerment of labor. That's very different from a simple decree raising the nominal wage. And the second objection is that this invidious contrast between direct and fiscal redistribution doesn't take into account the extent to which the size or the threshold of fiscal redistribution after the fact correction might actually begin to disorganize the real economy and to do precisely what Piketty fears, undermine the system of relative prices. The corrective redistribution might have to be massive to reckon with the degree of inequality. Now, that's precisely what happens. What then is the content in the circumstances of the contemporary societies of the redistribution, of the change in the arrangements that define the primary distribution, as opposed to just correcting the primary distribution after the fact, the secondary distribution? It seems that there are three elements that have priority. And I'm going to say little about each of them because, with the exception of the third, we've discussed or will discuss each of them in much greater detail. So the first element has to do with the status of labor vis-a-vis capital, the empowerment of labor. And this is an example of the conception of equality which I proposed at the outset. Equality of agency, equality of empowerment, rather than the generic equality of opportunity on the one hand, or the rigid equality of circumstance and outcome on the other. And there are two issues that are urgent today. Behind each of them stands a long-term problem or a long-term prospect. So the first issue is the status of precarious labor, the increasing part of the labor force in every contemporary economy that is being consigned to precarious or unstable employment. We need a different legal regime to reconcile genuine flexibility in the labor market with the security of employment, and not permit that the slogan of flexibility be a euphemism condemning the majority of the labor force to radical economic insecurity. And behind that stands the great issue of the future of economically dependent wage labor as the predominant form of free work. In relation to the higher forms of free work, self-employment, and cooperation. We'll discuss that after the spring recess. The second urgent question with respect to the relation of labor vis-a-vis capital is the consequence of the evolution of technology for the substitution of labor. So how, by what way, can we shape the evolution of technology so that it augments labor instead of replacing it? Given that the form of technological evolution and its social consequences are always indeterminate. So by initiatives of the state, like the one that Danny Roderick described at the technological frontier, that open the path, show the way, by regulatory or fiscal policy, by the reform of education, and above all, by the empowerment of labor vis-a-vis capital. The empowerment of labor to have access to the advanced practice of production and to have power within the part of the production system where that advanced practice already flourishes. The second major component of this attempt to influence the primary distribution of advantage, rather than just to correct the inequality after the fact, has to do with empowerment through productive uplift. And it's exactly what we discussed in the last 2 weeks. With respect to the firms and with respect to individual economic agents outside firms. The mass of firms, especially small and medium-sized firms, that are stuck in the rear guard of production to be brought closer to the vanguard through forms of decentralized strategic coordination between governments and producers, on the analogy of 19th century agricultural extension, and through cooperative competition among the producers. And the same with respect to the individualized economic agents who are outside firms, especially in the middle part of the job structure, the part of the job structure that has been hollowed out by the recent economic changes. Once again, to go to their aid and to transform them into technologically equipped artisans. Now, the third component of these initiatives has to do with the change of education. And that's the element about which we've spoken least so far. And for the moment, I simply want to say that to my mind, this third component has two sides. One side is the character or quality of education. A very particular kind of education that has the promise of empowering in an inclusive form. A form of education that gives priority to analytic and synthetic capabilities, that with respect to content prefers selective depth to encyclopedic superficiality, that puts cooperation or teamwork in the place of the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism, and that approaches all subjects dialectically by contrasting points of view. Nothing taught just once, everything taught at least twice from two opposing points of view. And that idea of general education goes together with a different view of technical or vocational training, which is that it prioritizes generic, practical, and conceptual capabilities rather than job-specific and machine-specific skills. So that's one side of the educational project, and the other side are a series of institutional initiatives that in countries that are large, unequal, and federal, reconcile national standards of investment in quality with the local management of the schools. For example, requiring procedures to take over a failing local school system, delegated to the administration of independent professionals, fix it and return it fixed. Now I come to the final part of my remarks. The argument which Danny and I share, that change in the fundamental distribution has priority over retrospective correction, does not exempt us from the need to develop a way of thinking about the legitimate and even indispensable role of retrospective correction. And in fact, there is a crossover, there's a bridge between the two. And the bridge is precisely the front on which classical social democracy had its greatest achievement: to sustain a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities. So I suggest that there are three principles that should orient our thinking about the relation between innovation in the arrangements that shape the primary distribution and policies designed to correct after the fact the inequalities generated in the market. The first principle is the one that has already been enunciated. Change in the arrangements that shape the primary distribution has priority over any attempt to correct that distribution after the fact. Now, the second principle governs how we should think about the corrective redistribution. It's subordinate, but it is not only legitimate, but indispensable. It has a role. But how should we conceive it? Now, the most common mistake that is made in thinking about corrective redistribution is to separate the two sides of the budget, the revenue-raising side and the spending side, and to focus on the progressive profile of the revenue-raising side without focusing on the aggregate level and the profile of the spending side. So to explain why this is important, let's begin with a paradox. The paradox is that among the rich industrial democracies of the North Atlantic world today, the one that on paper has the most progressive tax system is the United States, which, as we know, is by far the most unequal of these countries. And the reason is that the United States relies heavily on the progressive and direct taxation of personal income. The tax systems of the much more egalitarian European social democracies are based heavily on the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax or its functional equivalent, a range of taxes, as in France, that are the equivalent to the value-added tax. Now, how can this be? What's the explanation? The explanation is that in the short run, what matters most for the aggregate redistributive effect of the budget is not the progressive profile of the budget on the revenue-raising side. It is simply the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. And the European countries take in at least 10% of GDP, more than the United States, in the aggregate tax take. Now, what's the relation of that fact to the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption? The relation is the following. The comprehensive flat rate value-added tax is conceptually the most neutral possible tax. Because you could think of the economy as an input-output table, the transformation of every input into an output with aggregation of value. And what the value-added tax in its purest and most comprehensive form does is to take a constant amount from the aggregation of value in the transformation of every input into every output. It is therefore, in principle, the tax that is most neutral with respect to relative prices. And it makes it possible to achieve the highest tax take with the least economic trauma. And that's the explanation of the mystery. So everything that is lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget can be gained in double on the spending side. Now, this fact is not understood clearly in the United States and not clearly explained even in Europe. The American progressives evidently prefer progressive pieties to redistributive effects. They know, or they should know, that progressive taxation has only a marginal effect on inequality. But in the absence of a structural program, the commitment to progressive taxation at election time becomes a device by which the politicians can show on whose side they are. Now we come to the third principle. There is nevertheless a role, even though a secondary role, for progressive redistributive taxation. Retrospective redistribution is subsidiary to change in the primary distribution through institutional innovation. And progressive taxation is subsidiary to the achievement of a high tax take with redistributive social spending. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a role. Now, how should we think about progressive taxation? There are two main targets of progressive taxation in principle. One is the hierarchy of the standards of living, and the other is the accumulation of economic power. The progressive income tax is a confused hybrid instrument which hits neither of these targets squarely. What in principle is the best instrument to hit the first target? It is an individualized consumption tax. And once the tax system has been organized on the basis of the indirect and regressive taxation of consumption, as through the VAT, it's relatively easy to add to it a progressive element. So what does this tax do? Its main theoretician was Nicholas Kaldor. His book, The Expenditure Tax. One of the two most notable oases in what is otherwise the intellectual desert of writings on taxation. The other one being Maurice Allé's work on the tax on capital. It says, you take the aggregate income of the individual, returns to labor and to capital, and you subtract from that invested savings. That difference is what the individual spends on himself, and therefore the hierarchy of standards of living. And you then tax on this slope, on this difference, on a steeply progressive slope. At a very low level of consumption, the individual pays nothing, he receives. That's the equivalent to the negative income tax. Higher on the slope, he begins to pay at a top margin, at a steeply progressive marginal rate, and very high at a level of luxury living, the individual can pay a multiple of 100%. The sky's the limit. Because in the income tax, 100% is conceptually the top marginal rate. But with the individualized consumption tax, you could say, for every dollar that the individual spends on himself, beyond a certain level, he might have to pay 3 to the government. 300% is the top rate. There's no technical difficulty in the administration of this tax, as the tax experts know. It's the same as the technical difficulties of the income tax. It's solely a question of political power and will. And if the progressives were sincere and clear-sighted in their devotion to redistribution through taxation, it seems that this is the tax that they would prefer. But that then leaves the other object of progressive taxation, which is the accumulation of economic power, not revealed in the hierarchy of the standards of living. And that the tax system can reach only much more bluntly, less effectively. The real solution is the institutional reordering of the economy and the forms of government, of access to the resources and opportunities of production. We can imagine the tax on capital, but once again, if it goes beyond a very modest rate, it will begin to disorganize the production system. The most accessible form of the tax on capital is the taxation of the hereditary transmission of property or its anticipation through gifts inter vivos, which has the advantage of appealing to the ideological prestige of the principle of equal opportunity. And then, at the end of every lifetime, shuffles the cards. Now, then, there's a central theme in this argument. The central theme is that equality without empowerment is a failed program. The only way in which we can become bigger is by becoming bigger together.
Well, we didn't have any chance for questions, comments from the class last week either. So I think maybe we should just open it up a little bit. So.
Yes.
Very similar ideas that you have proposed refer large part of the 20th century, the superiority of self-employment and cooperative employment. And it didn't turn out to be a success story. So it would be interesting if you would reflect on the historical precedents of realization of what you have proposed. And just one more point, just to add one minor point. And I come from Hungary, which did introduce a VAT tax of 27% in 2011, I believe, to make room for a flat income tax. And this particular tax, because of the regressive...
Say that last part again, please.
A very high VAT tax was in fact introduced in my country in 2011 to make room for a flat income tax. And because of the regressivity of the VAT tax, actually it was radically against the interests of the poor.
Of course.
It was a major redistribution of income from the poor to the rich.
Of course. So let me say about both things. So first of all, on the labor point, we haven't discussed labor yet. That's our, I believe, our first or second class after the recess.
first, I believe.
Yeah, the first class after the recess. So all I did today was to signal on the two issues that are proximate. Self-employment is not proximate. That's for the future. So the emergency issues with respect to labor are, first, the status of precarious labor and how it is to be protected vis-a-vis capital. And second, the shaping or guidance of technological evolution so that the advanced front of the economy not move in the direction of simply replacing labor rather than augmenting and complementing it. I simply pointed to a discussion that I'd like to have in the future about the status of free work. In the 19th century, everyone, all the liberals and all the socialists, believed that economically dependent wage labor was a defective and transitory form of free work. John Stuart Mill, Abraham Lincoln, as well as Karl Marx, that would give way in the future to the higher forms of free work, self-employment and cooperation. Evidently, self-employment and cooperation cannot prevail without a solution to the problem of aggregation of resources at scale. So a simple cooperativism or self-management or self-ownership, as in the old Yugoslav system, for example, can't work. So there's a connection between the status of labor and innovation in the property regime. But that's not something for now. That's something for another historical stage, as I see it. Now, then you come to your remark about the VAT. The VAT is not intrinsically good. The VAT is avowedly regressive. What happens in the debates about taxation in the contemporary world is that the conservatives, the right, wants a flat tax at a low rate with a low tax take. The progressives want steeply progressive taxation. No one proposes what I proposed for the short term, which is a temporary reliance on regressive taxation in the context of a highly progressive national project. That is, the reason is to elevate the aggregate tax take in order to have this change. So you can't assess the significance of the VAT outside of the historical context in which it occurs. And that's the point. I say the progressives are confused because they appeal to progressive taxation to achieve the redistribution that they desire. Progressive taxation cannot achieve that redistribution unless it reaches a scale at which it begins to disorganize the economy. And that's why, in fact, it doesn't happen.
So in other words, what you're saying is you want a consumption tax or a value-added tax, not to compensate for the revenue loss of having a lower income tax or a flat income tax. It was the case that was described in the Hungarian
Yes.
case, but to actually finance a significant expansion of government spending. And that the progressivity would come from the the expansion of public expenditure.
So let me say the same thing in a different way. So the political economic model that is most admired in the world is not the United States, it's not the American one, it's Scandinavian social democracy. So if the world could vote, it would vote to become Sweden. But not the real Sweden, some mythical Sweden of the 1970s. So in the real Sweden, there were many decades of struggle between the Swedish state and the family plutocrats who continue to own a large part of the production system in the country. over economic and political power. And this struggle then ended in a kind of compromise. So they continue there, these dynastic entrepreneurial families. They continue to own a large part of the production system. The Swedish state has expropriated part of their power. That's the historical compromise. In the aftermath of that compromise, they then develop this welfare state, which complemented what had been achieved through those struggles. So the situation in the world is, the world wants the epilogue, which is this Swedish welfare state, but it doesn't want, or it doesn't see the narrative that preceded the epilogue. That's a confusion. So this redistributive system has a role, but it's an entirely subsidiary role.
But what's interesting in your take is quite uncharacteristically, you're giving incredible credence to the standard right-wing conservative view that high rates of income taxation at the margin, or high rates of marginal or significant increase in progressivity would have such adverse incentive effects that it would fundamentally damage the operation of the economic machine.
Not quite.
So I think we should give the progressives, at least the American progressives, a little bit more credit, that I think they are, I believe, rightfully emphasizing that old sort of 1980s, 1990s view that high rates of marginal taxation have very adverse incentive effects or very adverse supply side effects, and therefore undermine the operation of the economic machine, has been more or less discredited. That the reason that the Europeans went with this particular combination of not very progressive income taxation and high rates of regressive consumption taxation has much more to do with the pervasive ideology of the time, which viewed income taxation to be very adversely, deleterious on the supply side, and also something we'll talk about later in the class, which is the international mobility of financial capital, which affected Europe to a much greater extent. The individual European nations being much more open and therefore much more threatened by the mobility of capital than the United States at the time was. And so this combination of ideology and the ability of the professional class and the financial class to evade taxation in the European context made the tax burden shift onto the working classes in the form of a consumption tax. So it wasn't a kind of a desirable combination. It was a combination that was forced on the European nations. And that if we take into account that, in fact, high degree of progressivity income taxation doesn't necessarily have very large adverse effects on incentives and the supply side of the economy, that I think that certainly in the United States, the argument for a significant increase in progressivity, including a wealth tax, would be very strong.
It's fine, but it doesn't reach the quantitative threshold to make a significant difference. It seems to me that to reach the threshold of dealing with the massive structural inequalities that exist in an economy like the American, the level of redistribution has to go far beyond what has been proposed. And so it's not just the taxation of a tiny number of billionaires, of great fortunes. It's the broad taxation of the asset holding class in the society. And to a point which then establishes this permanent tension between the operation of the present market order and the attempted redistributive correction.
No, we don't quite disagree. I think we probably would agree that in the United States that both a broader-based consumption tax movement, possibly to something like a VAT, and more progressivity in the income tax would be desirable. But let me just make one other point before I take more comments or questions. The main difference between Europe and the United States, and I showed a picture in terms of how much more inequality has increased, and so I think let's keep the important things in perspective, and which is consistent with what you were saying and what I was saying earlier, that you can ask the question, the reason that inequality in Europe has not increased so much more than in the United States, is it due to the fact that Europeans engage in much more fiscal redistribution than the United States, or is it because the European economies are much better in distributing income in this primary field of distribution of advantage? And the answer seems to be the latter.
The latter with one addition, which is very important, which is what I describe as the greatest achievement of historical social democracy, which is the development of a package of endowments settled on the citizens in the form of high social entitlements
Yes.
and public services, which are capability assuring endowments.
I think that's right. So both in terms of increasing the endowments of individuals and prospective workers, and also in terms of the conditions of production and employment.
Which are exempted from the market order. So, and this is a very important point in which, because there's this idea of a haven in which the individual is secure in this haven, and the haven are of the safeguards and endowments that are then taken out of the market. And that's what seems to me to cross the bridge between corrective redistribution and change in the primary distribution. But that's not the problem. The problem is that there's the haven, but there's not what in an earlier class I called the store. That is the organization of this change in the economic and political institutions that radicalizes the experimentalist impulse.
Yeah.
I have two questions, and one of them actually jumped into that. I think it was also mentioned, like within France, you mentioned a little bit about France as well. But I'm just wondering, like I'm from Belgium, Europe myself, and I had the impression, okay, we have more redistribution, more better welfare policies and everything, but the rise of authoritarianism, which is one of the aims I think underlying driving this class, the rise of authoritarianism is as big and maybe bigger than it's in the US. We just have a parliamentary system which like stops that rise of it. So how come even if we have better policies from this perspective, we still have this bad outcome? That's my first question. My second question is about I think a lot of the policies that are being mentioned to be implemented require that you almost have a closed economy. Like you can have capital flight, and like I mean I know it touches upon one of the later classes, but like how do you see, for example, a wealth tax, more progressive taxation, all these things? How do you see that implemented if you include international dimension?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can maybe talk about the international dimension a little bit more when we have our session on globalization, but I think in principle all of these things are manageable in the context of fairly open economies. For example, in the context of a wealth tax or progressive taxation, there are a lot of proposals about combining it with financial registries in financial tax havens. In the case of corporate taxation, having corporate taxes be apportioned on the basis of sales so that corporations cannot evade those taxes in a global economy simply by establishing paper headquarters or paper subsidiaries somewhere else. And in the limit, in a place like the United States, simply revoking the citizenship of individuals if they're not. So there are lots of strategies that are available. But I think more broadly than such strategies, I think part of what I think both Roberto and I have in mind is that the kinds of obligations that might be imposed on productive units or firms aren't punitive in the sense that they come together. Remember the quid pro quo. It's that they're also it's a way of engaging and providing benefits to firms and services that in turn enhance their productivity. So that the puzzle of why at the height of the social democratic Scandinavian experience, why firms that were being taxed at a much greater rate, where income taxes were that much higher, labor taxes were that much higher, why Sweden still hosted so many world-class companies, is that those public impositions of high taxes or other requirements went along with the provision of public inputs and public infrastructure and skilled labor force and all of that more than compensated for those. So that the overall the ecosystem that's created is one that's sufficiently productive that in an economic sense also actually compensates for some of these potential disadvantages.
But I do want to just correct an interpretation there. So it's not as if I think either of us, and certainly not me, not I, we're arguing that, as the American progressives often do, that the solution for the United States is to become more like Europe, or like this imaginary Europe of the 1970s. So from my standpoint, institutionally conservative social democracy or social liberalism is a failed project. It has not sustained an inclusive rise in productivity or in empowerment. And it has no adequate practical basis of social solidarity or social cohesion. So there are these two fundamental problems. There's the economic problem, and there's the social or moral problem. What's the basis of social cohesion or solidarity? It's money transfers organized by the state against the background of ethnic and cultural homogeneity. If the ethnic and cultural homogeneity are eroded by migratory flows, the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes manifest. And so this double failure, at once economic and social, then creates the vacuum within which right-wing authoritarian populism advances. In Europe as in the United States.
There was one question on my mind for you, Roberto. I don't know if we'll have time. Maybe I'll just pose it and then you'll have to answer it some other time. When you were discussing the issue of how can we get some of the advantages of a war economy without actually having to go through war. And it seems to me sort of, the basic liberal conception would be that that we all have very different conceptions of the good life and how the world works. And in normal times, that precludes the kind of collective mobilization because there is no overarching objective that combines all our efforts in a particular direction. That war, of course, is a very different time when that those individual conceptions of the good life and the means to a good life are overtaken by this singular objective of fighting and defending the country, and that's why those times are actually special, and that it would not be possible, nor in fact feasible, to expect or mobilize such collective enthusiasm and energy during peace war. That sort of would be incompatible with the notion of a society in which we all have different conceptions of the good life and the means to achieve it. Do you have a
So
30 second answer?
So 30 second, what I'd say is, so the liberal idea to which you've referred is that there are sectarian visions of the good, and there's an impersonal system of right that is neutral. There is no neutral impersonal system because every framework tilts the scales, and the claim of neutrality is alleged in service of the opposite, to entrench it against attack. So why are there nations in the world? so that humanity can develop different forms of life embodied in different institutions. And these are experiments in humanity. And they have to be energized then by the multiplication of forms of collective action. That has to take the place of war.
But that's your answer to why nations exist. Mine could be different.
Of course, and then we have a debate about this. But so the idea is humanity develops its powers only by developing them in different directions. And then so we then, it's this idea that we, so, you know, Cervantes says, when we dream alone, it's just a dream. But when we dream together, it's the beginning of reality. And that's why nations exist.
Well, everybody have a great break. We'll see you in 2 weeks, and stay safe and healthy.